Welcome to Tell the Whole Damn World in our long overdue Cal History episode. It's Friday, September 5th, 2025. Jaron Chiave Sangapulatele is already getting national press, the likes of which hasn't been seen around these parts in a long time. And as I always like to say around here, it's another great day to be a bear. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Reza Serafinishad. I realize we haven't done a Cal History episode in some time, so it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Leslie Mitchell back to the show today to teach all of us about Cal's very first Nobel Prize winner, Ernest O. Lawrence. Before we get into our discussion today, let me quickly tell you a little more about us and what we're all about. We're the podcast that celebrates all things Cal and the prominent people associated with UC Berkeley, known to many as the center of the universe. We hope to put a smile on your face and help you come away feeling good about your connection to the greatest university on the planet. If you have friends who went to Cal, please tell them all about us. You can share us on social media, and you can always find our latest YouTube videos posted directly to our website at tellthewholedamnworld.com. And remember, with football season in full swing now, you can look forward to catching us 2 times each week. We'll plan to release our football recap episode each Monday throughout the season and bring you either a new featured guest or Cal History episode each Friday. Okay, let's bring Leslie on and we'll learn all about the man who put Cal on the map when it comes to UC Berkeley's world-renowned academic reputation.
This week in Cal History.
Leslie Mitchell is our resident Cal history expert. She's a third-generation Cal alum, history and Dutch double major, and lifelong Golden Bear fan who writes wonderfully informative articles about notable people connected with our university who have done great things in this world. You can visit her website, calbearshistory.com, or follow her on Twitter at calbearshistory to learn more about the people who have been a part of the rich history of the University of California. You hear me say this all the time, but we couldn't be more lucky to have Leslie as part of the show. Today, Leslie and I are going to talk about Cal's very first Nobel Prize winner and the father of the cyclotron and accelerator physics, Ernest O. Lawrence. Welcome again to the show, Leslie.
Well, thank you, Reza, and thanks always for your kind words. As I understand it, your major was physics. Is that right?
Well, yes, but this was a long time ago, Leslie, and I did nothing with it, to be honest with you.
Well, that's fine, but you're like leap years ahead of me in understanding physics. So now that we're talking about a Nobel Prize winning physicist, I hope I can count on your Cal physics degree to help us out.
Yeah. Well, I did start early, of all things, at the Lawrence Hall of Science, which was my getaway and one of my favorite places to go to when I was growing up here in the Berkeley area. I loved going to the Lawrence Hall of Science.
I wonder who that was named after.
I wonder. That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Ernest Orlando Lawrence, and I wish I knew where the Orlando came from because it's funny, in the context of a farm boy from South Dakota, but I don't know. I shouldn't say he was a farm boy. He was born and raised in a little town in rural South Dakota. I think his dad was the mayor or something, and his parents were both high school teachers. So he wasn't exactly a farm boy. But as we were talking about before we went on, maybe the single most extraordinary thing about Ernest O. Lawrence is he grew up on a street in this town of 2,000 people in South Dakota, Canton, South Dakota, where he became a Nobel Prize winning physicist. His brother became a notable doctor and a physicist who got into nuclear medicine at UCSF and at Berkeley using his brother's cyclotron. And the kid across the street was named Melvin Tooze, and he became the head of the applied physics lab at Johns Hopkins University and was a very notable physicist himself. So it was a heck of a little street in the tiny town in South Dakota.
That's pretty amazing. I mean, that blew my mind when I read through what you'd put together for this. And, another little thing, just to kind of let people know, all the work that Leslie puts into helping to prepare for these episodes. It was a 443-page book that you read. Was that it just the other day?
Yeah, I read that over the weekend.
Well, no wonder that you went into law. I guess you're not afraid of reading a lot.
Well, also my history major, it's sort of, unlike some people, I put my degree to use.
Well, so and he was born in August, which, I'm a fan of because I'm Leo as well, but he was born on August 8th, 1901. And as you mentioned, both of his parents were high school teachers, and both of his parents were the offspring of Norwegian immigrants. Does that sound
Correct.
right?
And he was really into technical stuff when he was a kid, as you wouldn't shock you. And his best friend, the guy across the street, Melvin Tooze, the two of them were like did make their own shortwave radios and all sorts of technical tinkering when they were kids. But his parents decided his parents were both very religious, and they didn't want him when he grew up getting any temptation. So they insisted that he go to a little Lutheran college called St. Olaf, which he hated because he thought it was really boring and stifling and not a lot of interesting people and what have you, and didn't do very well his freshman year.
Yeah, he got like a lot of C's apparently. He was just kind of, coasting through, was not really applying himself from the sound of it, right?
Well, he was very unhappy there, and so what he did, this is symptomatic of his personality, because throughout his life, Lawrence was known as somebody that just never let anything stand in his way. If he had a goal, he was gonna do it. So what he did is he got a summer job in the town of Vermilion, South Dakota, which happens to be where the University of South Dakota is located. And without telling his parents, he dropped out of St. Olaf and enrolled in the University of South Dakota. And they were not happy when they found out, but it was sort of a fait accompli, so they just let it go. Although Vermilion today has a population of 11,000 people, so I don't really see it as being this big city full of temptations. But you never know.
You never know, but that whole story kind of strikes me, similar at least in some ways with Ahmad Anderson and his mom, and how his mom changed his application without his knowing, and applied to UC Berkeley when he had no intention of going to Cal at the time, and then he joined the football team unbeknownst to his mom, and this kind of funny.
So what you're saying is Ahmad's going to get a Nobel Prize in football.
That's right. After he becomes mayor of Richmond, that's the next logical
There you
step,
go.
I'd say.
What happened at South Dakota, though, really changed his whole life, because he was planning to be a doctor. That was his goal to go. He was pre-med, and he took a chemistry class from a professor named Lewis Ackley. And Ackley saw his promise as a scientist and told him, take a physics class. Just take it. I think you'll really like it. So he did, and he fell in love with the subject. And that just was it. That bye-bye to being a doctor and off to being a physicist. And for the rest of his life, he always attributed his success to that professor. He kept his picture up in his office the rest of his life. So teachers, you have an impact.
Yes, you're right. Absolutely. There's no question about that. And so he went from University of South Dakota, and he actually got his degree in chemistry, if I'm not mistaken, but he had that love for physics that you just mentioned that he really gained there at the University of South Dakota, and then went on to Minnesota to get his master's, right?
Correct. In physics, master's in
Right.
physics. So he switched over to physics. And his professor there was sort of his mentor, was a guy named William Swan. And when Swan moved over to Yale, Lawrence decided to go to get his PhD at Yale, which he did in 2 years.
Yeah.
It's like, wait a minute, he got his MA in 1924, and he's getting his PhD in 1926. He was 25 years old. Like, wow.
He made it look easy. Yep. You could tell he was full of promise. That's for sure.
Well, full of promise, Yale immediately offered him, when he got his degree, they offered him an assistant professorship. So
Yep.
that's a pretty
Yep.
good sign that they thought highly of him.
That's right.
But
That's right.
also, he was at that time offered assistant professorships by University of Washington and the University of California. But he decided to stay at Yale at that time. But Cal kept him in their sights.
Right. Cal was persistent and dogged in their pursuit of him, from what I understand, right? And
Well,
when it came,
at that time, Berkeley just did not have much of a physics department. It was a total backwater in physics. And that was one of the things they wanted to do at that time. Robert Gordon Sproul was the president, and he wanted to up the game in Berkeley and make it more of a prestigious academic institution. Yale was the gold standard for American physics, but as I understand it, at that time, American physics was not very highly regarded in general. The Europeans really looked down on them as kind of
Right.
second class.
Well, this all kind of goes hand in hand with our episode about Robert Gordon Sproul, with that decision that was ultimately made to make Berkeley a research institution. And it kind of all went hand in hand with Ernest O. Lawrence, who was just such a promising talent in physics that to kind of just set the stage for everyone, this is really the genesis. This is the origin for how Berkeley achieved its tremendous academic standing in the world. This is really where it all started. Prior to
Yes.
that, wasn't really known for much, right?
I mean, it was a perfectly okay state
Sure,
school.
sure,
It was, and certainly, in the West, it was one of the better schools because, but it wasn't anywhere in the league with the Ivy Leagues. People would have laughed if you compared it to Harvard or Yale or Princeton. So he'd been a couple of years, I think it was 1928, had been an assistant professor at Yale for a couple of years. And Cal came back and offered him, they sent Professor Burge, of whom Burge Hall is named. They offered him an assistant professorship, which meant he was automatically tenured. And they offered him a salary bump. And they offered him basically the chance to do any kind of research he felt like.
right.
Which was a big deal because Yale was very, like all the Eastern school, like most schools, period, even the Europeans, they were very regimented. You're a this level professor, you're an assistant professor, you're going to teach X number of undergraduate classes, your time's going to be spent this way. And Cal basically said, teaching, yeah, you don't really have to do that teaching thing, which was a big sell because he wanted to spend his time researching.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think that was the big thing that ultimately put Cal over the top, was the opportunity to have kind of free reign with wherever he wanted to take his research. And sure, he had to teach some upper level graduate classes potentially, but not much. And you could really
Right.
focus in
And he
on that
actually
research.
enjoyed working with the senior graduate students because those people are the ones that he then got into the lab to do a lot of free work for him.
Right, right.
Some things never change.
So he came to Cal in 1928, and he stayed at Cal all the way through 1958 when he ultimately passed, but getting way ahead of us to that part.
Yeah, for the rest of his life, he stayed. Although people were always trying to poach him, as you
Right.
could imagine. These
Right.
things, again, things don't change. Other universities are always offering him various.
And hey, everybody, it's not just in football. If you got a hot
Oh, yeah,
shot in the academic
he was
field,
like
same kind of thing.
constantly in the transfer portal. That's what I was thinking when I was reading this. He was a perpetual target for the portal.
That's right. But Cal, and very much thanks to Robert Gordon Sproul for basically meeting his every request and for more and more money to help fund research that he was doing on campus at that time. And the dollar amounts got to be really high, like astronomically high for that time. But we'll get into that. But we successfully fended off all those other people.
Yeah,
and
we'll talk about that
organizations
when we
right.
get there. But yeah, he was
Right.
definitely the celebrity scientist, I guess you could say, if that is. I mean, certainly was a thing then.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was at Cal just a year. It was 1929. He was 28 years old. And his story was he was sitting in what he called an interminable faculty meeting. And he had picked up a journal that was in German. And why exactly he was looking at this journal, because he didn't read German. But he was just, as he said, he was paging through it, because he was bored listening to the blah, blah, blah at a faculty meeting. And he couldn't read the text, but he could see the drawings and the photographs and the formulas that were in the article. And as he was going through it, as he describes it, he was just suddenly struck with this idea that basically changed everything for him and for the world, really, which was the idea for the cyclotron.
That's right. And I mean, I was struck by, you think of the cyclotron, you see it up on the hill, and it's a big building, but it started out really small. And that I think is one of the kind of the cool things that kind of fell out of after having read a lot of what you put together and just kind of knowing some of my history with physics and all of that.
The issue that they were trying to address, the physics world, was they were trying to see what's inside an atom, because at that point, they really didn't have a lot of insight into what the inside of an atom consisted of. And the way they wanted to do that was by smashing an atom, so it would basically break open, and then they could look and see, okay, what's in there. But the problem was they had to get enormously high speeds. And stop me if I get any of this wrong, Mr. Physics major. 'Cause Miss History major over here, she's just doing the best she can.
You're
But
doing pretty good.
they wanted to achieve these like enormously high speeds. I think Ernest Rutherford, the European scientist, had said that he thought they would need 10 million electron volts to achieve those speeds. And they didn't, that kind of power just didn't exist in the world at that time. So it's like, well, how do we get them going up to enough speed so that they will in fact smash? And what Lawrence came up with, it seems obvious today in retrospect, but nobody had thought of it before, is we'll make it a circle, make it a spiral. But this article by this German guy, Rolf Weidenroth, he said, well, instead of just trying to have this massive amount of power to make it go fast, just keep jolting it, get it going to a certain speed and then jolt it again and then jolt it again and then jolt it again. But this would take like miles of space to cause this to happen, which was totally impractical. So again, what seems blindingly obvious now is what Lawrence says, well, make it a circle. Make it go round
Right.
and round and round, and you can jolt it every so often, jolt it every time it comes around.
Right. Well, it's such an elegant idea. And even just listening to one of the documentaries about how we kind of came up with the idea, but like every child on the playground knows, like if you're swinging, basically you could just give the child a really large swing, or you could keep on giving increasing pushes to get the child to swing higher and higher and higher. And so that was basically, where it all came from, this idea of giving it these little pushes and these increments and using the electromagnets to provide that push every single time around. So
Right.
it
The
could get
idea was to put this circular tube that the particles would be in, suspend it between two really powerful electromagnets that would keep them in their spiral path so they don't just fly off, and also give them the opportunity to give them the jolts of electricity to get them going faster.
look at you. You sound like a physics major to me.
And it had to be in a vacuum. That was his other
That's right.
insight, because otherwise you'd have these like little, God knows what little random thing in the air that would introduce itself, and then the whole thing would be ruined. So that was the basic insight: a circular spiral rotation of the particles, the electromagnets, and the vacuum. So it sounds really simple, right?
Well, it's a really elegant idea. I mean, that's the cool thing, and it's, it achieves all of this in a small amount of space, which is really the incredible thing, I think,
What I love is apparently he ran home after the faculty meeting, and he was living at the faculty club, which I love too, on campus. Apparently that was the thing to do for all these young bachelor guys who were professors, assistant
and
professors.
Oppenheimer, I think, was there as well, right? In the
And
faculty
not
club.
yet at that time, but
No,
soon,
okay,
like the next
sure.
year or so, he
Okay.
arrived. Yeah, and later, like Glenn Seaborg lived there, Edmund Macmillan lived there, a bunch of Nobel Prize winners. So next time you walk by the faculty club, give it away.
Yeah.
And by the way, I recently saw that you can actually rent a room, like at the faculty club, like for a hotel. They run it as, you want to go over to Berkeley for a weekend, you can rent a room and stay there, which would be kind of cool. You might get Ernest Lawrence or Robert
That's right.
Oppenheimer's room.
That's right. Imagine that. That's part of history for sure.
So he ran back to the faculty club and he told everybody, oh my God, I just had this great experiment. And he was bubbling over with excitement, as he usually was. And somebody said, well, what are you going to do with it? And he said, smash atoms.
Well, I love this part that apparently he was described as relentlessly optimistic and infectiously enthusiastic. And I think that's a big part of really why he was as successful as he was. When he set his mind, like you had mentioned earlier, to achieve something, he made it happen somehow, some way. And also, just to kind of get back to the idea of how Cal was able to fend off other schools that were trying to poach him and take him away, he became the youngest full professor on campus and was commanding a pretty good salary. And, it kind of got some animosity from the other faculty because, like, who is this young guy who's on the scene and making all this money?
Well,
But
if I could
yeah.
just interrupt. Yeah, actually what happened was Northwestern tried to poach him a couple years later. They offered him like $12,000 a year, which is the equivalent of like $250,000 a year now or something, which was double what any other professor at Cal was making. If you're going to match that, yeah, Sproul was faced with do we lose this guy or do we piss off the entire faculty by giving this 30-year-old kid double their salary plus all these other things that Northwestern had promised in terms of support for the research? Ultimately, Sproul said yes.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I think that's just such a critical decision, to have been made to retain him and to keep him here because again, ultimately because of the invention of the cyclotron, won the Nobel Prize in 1939, became the very first Nobel Prize winner on campus. And I guess I'm getting a little bit ahead of a few things here with that, but I have to say this because I was so struck and I didn't know about any of this until after having read your Cliff Notes version of that 443-page book that you read. But, whenever the Nobel Prize is awarded, it's always awarded in Sweden. Oh, you fly across, you get there, or I guess even by boat, potentially if it were earlier than 1939. But because of looming tensions in Europe and World War II had broken out.
Yeah, it wasn't looming tensions. It was a world war.
Yeah, that's right. I guess in 1939, we're talking about the World War having broken out. So what they did was they actually had the Nobel Prize ceremony for Ernest O. Lawrence in Wheeler Hall. I mean, I did not know that. That is some
Well, you need to follow the Cal Bears history Twitter account. Although the thing is, it happened on February 29th of 1940, so I only tweet about it every 4 years.
Right. I guess I might have missed that one. But that is so cool because, what Cal student hasn't spent time in Wheeler Hall? And I mean, you go back, Gregory Peck having done plays in Wheeler Hall, and now you find out that the Nobel Prize winning the very first Nobel Prize awarded to anyone associated with Cal was there at Wheeler Hall. I mean, that is pretty cool stuff. So,
but that's distant future. Let's get back to he's just starting the work that will get him the Nobel Prize.
I got a little overly exuberant.
I can understand that. I thought it was pretty cool when I saw that too. I mean, on the one hand, it's probably disappointing he didn't get the king and the royal reception and all of that. But on the other hand, he got everybody he knew got to be there.
That's right.
Which is pretty cool.
Right. Very cool.
Okay, so we were talking about the first idea of the cyclotron. So he had one of his graduate students helped him create a prototype, which has been described as looking like a whiskey flask that got run over by a truck. When I read that, I said, yes, because I've seen the photo of it, and it's exactly what it looks like.
So true, right? It's like, what is this?
It was made out of brass and wire and sealing wax. So it's probably not going to be much of a vacuum. I don't think sealing wax creates a vacuum, last I heard. But it was just the idea of how it would be constructed, and they would have in this little 4-inch cyclotron. That's how the first prototype was, 4 inches wide cyclotron.
So small.
And it didn't actually work, but that's what he mocked up to show Sproul and others. But what he really needed was a really powerful magnet. And that's what blew me away reading about this stuff is these magnets are like, oh my God, I didn't know there were magnets that powerful.
Yeah. And really heavy. I mean, I don't even know how you transport things like that. I mean, you're
very
talking about
carefully.
Yeah.
Don't lift it. You're going to hurt your back. 800 tons or whatever it was. Yes. So he had to go to Sproul for the first time to get special funding. He needed the first one cost $25. So he was able to get that out of this prototype. But when he wanted to make a real one that he thought would actually work, in order to buy a more powerful magnet and all the rest of it, to make the 11-inch one, which was the first one that actually worked, he had to go get, I think it was $600 from Sproul, which it was, several $1,000s equivalent today. So it was not nothing. But still, Sproul said, sure. That was the first time he ever said, yeah, you can have this extra funding. And it wouldn't be the last, I assure you. So he made the 11-inch one. And yes, it worked. But it wouldn't, the speeds just weren't high enough because you just have to have an enormous magnet. But it proved the principle. So then they moved on. We get these successive ones. That was the 11-inch. Then the next one, he said, okay, I really need to make a real one that will really go fast enough. That has a big enough magnet. It's going to be so big, I'm going to need my own building for this. And there was a building on campus that was known as the Civil Engineering Testing Laboratory. It's an old wooden building that had been built in 1885. They were about to tear it down. Just a one-story little wooden building up on the east end of campus.
That's right. Yep.
And he said, "Could I have that building?" And Sproul said, "Sure. We're going to tear it down
You could
anyway."
tear it down anyway. Right. Go ahead. Go for it.
So that was he got the building. He found that there was a magnet,
A 4,000 metric
a
ton.
4,000-ton magnet.
Yeah.
Yes. That
Yeah.
was sitting unused at a company in San Francisco because somebody had ordered it for some big project in China, and that project got canceled, and this company it was like in their parking lot, sitting there unused. And Lawrence went there and convinced this company to donate it to the university so that they could have a charitable deduction for it, which saved a lot of money.
Can you
And then
imagine?
he got funding for the rest of it.
What I was going to say was this idea that, how incredibly fortunate is it that the stars align, that there's happens to be this ridiculously powerful and heavy magnet that just happens to be close enough. It is all the stars aligning for that to happen. I mean, really?
Sitting unused just in San Francisco that
Yeah.
nobody wanted.
Right.
And this company was like, "What are we going to do with it?" "All right, you can have it." And he got funding from the university, and he also got funding from he started going, this is when he started his grand project of going to foundations and corporate boards and all sorts of organizations. But at this point, mostly charitable foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation and various other science groups to get donations to fund all of this. And it cost the equivalent of about $95,000 today to build the thing. And then the regents agreed to kick in the money for the ongoing operation, which is also not insubstantial.
No.
So this was the 27-inch cyclotron,
Right. And
which was
this is
the real
again,
first one that really started smashing some of them atoms.
right. I mean, this is the 1930s. I mean, those dollar amounts, are
1931, yes.
yeah. I mean, that is
Absolute depths of the Great Depression, yes.
right. Exactly. I mean, money was not easy to come by, and the idea that he was able to really encourage people to kind of see his vision and to open up their wallets to fund this. And one of the big things, and they talk about, there's a quote that I've got that queued up that I can tell all of you about a little later on, but it's this idea of big science, that prior to Ernest O. Lawrence, you had these scientists who were working kind of just as individuals, not as part of teams, and especially cross-disciplinary scientists who were all invited to team up and to use their collective knowledge of what they could do to contribute to what they were trying to build. So the term big science comes from this idea that you had these teams of scientists from all different disciplines working together, but then also this idea too that this was not cheap science, not something that you could do without really a lot of funding. And typically that meant government funding. And so how you
for
achieve
the early
that.
years, he didn't have any government funding until really close to World War II. These early years, it
That's
was
true.
mostly foundations.
That's true. Right. So yeah. So I mean, the fact that he was able to do and to generate and raise that kind of money, like you'd mentioned, during the Depression was just truly amazing to think. So he must have had a real great way with
Yeah,
people.
he was apparently incredibly charismatic. People were just really drawn to him. And again, as you said before, he was incredibly enthusiastic and inspirational, and apparently had a real knack for explaining science technicalities to lay people so that they would get excited about it. We always have this vision of scientists being sort of, particularly back then, sort of fuddy-duddy old guys with, that mumbled a lot and talked in terms that nobody could understand. And all of a sudden you have this he's like 30 years old and he's excited and he got people worked up about it, and he could explain why this was a big deal.
Right. No.
So yeah, and this really kicked in when he got 1931, when his own lab opened, which was in 33. They gave it the name the Radiation Laboratory, which it was known as for the rest of his life. And after his death, of course, it became Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory.
Right.
But
Yeah.
they called it the Rad Lab, which I
Rad
love.
Lab.
Is kind of, it's so like almost 1960s sounding.
It does,
This
right?
lab is so rad. So they very informal atmosphere. Everybody pitched in. He got chemists in there. As you said, it was traditionally before that. A physicist would never dream of having a chemist on his team. Why would you do that? But when you think you're talking about where do we learn the periodic table of the elements from? We learned that in chemistry class.
Sure.
So if you're going to create chemical elements, why would you not have a chemist in there to help you figure out interpret what it is you're getting, what your results are?
Right. But it was also scientists, who were studying biology and kind of seeing the impact that this all fed into what Ernest Lawrence is credited for as well, which was basically this idea of using radiation as a treatment for different cancers and things like that can be attributed to all of this. So
What
this,
became known as nuclear medicine, at which
that's right.
which we still have radiation
That's right.
treatments and all of that. Yeah, that was a big, and that was a double benefit because he got these biology people in there to help him with this idea. Also, there's a lot of funding to be had from medical foundations.
That's true. That's true. Right.
You always had the one eye on we got to get this incredible science done, and the other eye on, we got to get the funding so that we can do the incredible science. There's a great story I read about Luis Alvarez, who later came to Cal and won a Nobel Prize himself in physics. And he was a grad student at Chicago. And he came to Berkeley and wanted a tour of the lab. And he said when he first saw the building, he thought, oh my God, this is a dump, small wooden building. The paint is peeling. Why did I come to Berkeley? And he said the minute he stepped over the threshold, it was the most exciting place I have ever seen, he said. And when he compared his experience in Chicago to what was going on at the Rad Lab, Chicago was wedded to the tradition of everybody worked on their own project behind a closed door. You didn't share equipment. Grad students always hoarded their equipment because they were afraid somebody else would take it and they'd never get it back. It was considered rude to comment on someone else's experiment or to make suggestions. Well, maybe you could do this or that to make it better. That was a breach of etiquette. So no one did that. And he came to the Rad Lab. He said, there were no doors.
Right.
Everybody's equipment was available for everybody else. People borrowed it. People used it. The cyclotron was available for everyone to use.
And I think it was just this wonderfully collaborative environment. And I think that's part of what also attracted all these other amazing scientists who all realized what was going on there in Berkeley. And I'll just have to say this little quote from, since you mentioned Luis Alvarez, who won the Nobel Prize, as you mentioned, in 1968. And he was part of the team that theorized that the Earth had been hit by a giant asteroid, which was what wiped out the dinosaurs and all of that. And little side note, I actually took a class at Cal back, I think I was just a high school student taking some classes here on campus, but it was taught by his son. And I was always like, whoa, that is like just awesome to think.
Actually, his son was part of his team. His son was a geologist. And so he was he was one of the main movers on the
Right.
dinosaur
Right.
theory.
But he had this to say. He says, Lawrence will always be remembered as the inventor of the cyclotron, but more importantly, he should be remembered as the inventor of the modern way of doing science. I think that's really an important thing. I mean, there's no question that, that was a real turning point for how science is done today. And then, attributable to all the remarkable advancements that we've made in all the different scientific fields that really could be taken all the way back to the Rad Lab here in Berkeley.
That's absolutely right. That's basically what I think it was also Alvarez who said the invention of team science was his greatest invention. The cyclotron was great and all of that, but the team science approach is really his greatest contribution. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger. They did a 60-inch one. Then he got an offer from Harvard to go there. And suddenly they're like, the university's like, okay, you want a 184-inch cyclotron? You want to build it up on the hill? We'll find the money. He went to the Rockefeller Foundation for that one. And they said, we don't have that. They want, I think, $2.5 million for that one. And they were like, we can't give you that. It's the Depression. We don't have that kind of money. I eventually got $1.5 million, I think, from the Rockefeller Foundation, which was the largest grant ever given to anyone in the history of the United States at that time.
Yeah, at that time. And I think it was 1.15 million or something along those lines. Like that. But that was the largest gift. I mean, at that time, that's an astronomical amount of money in today's dollars. years for sure.
I'd
War
like to
II and
talk a
all that.
little bit about the Nobel Prize.
Yes. Okay. I saw there was a documentary that you pointed me to that I think was done by Lawrence Livermore Labs talking about Ernest O. Lawrence. And they had little clips of must have been the day when he was awarded the Nobel Prize on campus and seeing all those old style cars on campus and all the paparazzi of that era. He was probably the I don't know if it's too far of a stretch to say, but he may have been the very first American rock star when it came to
Well, that's
science, right?
fair. I mean, there were
Yeah,
European scientists who were as famous and more famous, but as far as an American-born scientist, yeah, he
right.
was the first really famous one. There was still a lot of question whether he would get the Nobel Prize because the Nobel Committee, like science in general, was very much wedded to the idea of the lone scientist searching for the truth, and also was very much focused on theoretical science as opposed to
Experimental.
experimental science, which is what Lawrence's forte was. And, the sort of hands-on doing things was considered, well, that's not really science. It all has to be just thinking. And when they gave him the Nobel for the cyclotron, that was for creating a, a tool to be used in experimentation. And that was a huge break from what they had given Nobels for in the past. It was also, by the way, the first Nobel Prize ever awarded to anyone affiliated with a state university in the United States, with a public school, which was also a big break because there was a very snooty attitude that, state schools were second rate, third rate. And not only just among the Europeans who give out the Nobel, but also within the United States. And so that was a big breakthrough for the Nobel Committee to give the prize to a guy in Berkeley.
That's right. That's right. Well, I'm always struck by you just kind of mentioned, theoretical and experimental. Kind of those two different sides of the coin when it comes to how you kind of approach science. And I think back at Christopher Nolan's 2023 movie Oppenheimer, where you get those glimpses of how Oppenheimer and Lawrence might have interacted in those days back at Cal. And Ernest Lawrence was portrayed by Josh Hartnett, who looked a lot like him. I mean, he looks like he probably fit the part pretty well. Lawrence, of
Especially the
course,
hair, the poofy hair.
right, right. And I just was always struck by that because I was thinking, yeah, I mean, obviously Oppenheimer's the lead character, but you see how well they teamed up and worked together to make all this a reality with the
Yeah,
theoretical
Oppenheimer was the
together.
theoretical guy, and
Right,
Lawrence was the experimental guy.
right, right,
So, and they actually were quite good friends in those days.
right.
As we mentioned, they both lived at the faculty club together for a couple of years, and Lawrence would go down to Oppenheimer's ranch in New Mexico. They loved to go horseback riding together, which is just such like, really? You don't
He's from
expect that.
he's from South Dakota. What else you gonna do, right?
Lawrence was a real athletic kind of guy. He wasn't, I mean, I shouldn't say he wasn't a great athlete, but he loved to compete in sports. He was a big tennis player. He apparently was a skier. And every time he went skiing, he would come back all beat up. I don't know if it wasn't that good athletically or he was just so overly optimistic and enthusiastic that he would even like overdo. But he was always falling, but hey, falling means you get right up and keep doing it. Was his way of looking at things. So yeah, they actually were quite friendly. That kind of soured after the war and when everything went south with Oppenheimer. In those early days in the 30s, it was quite the place in Berkeley.
Right. Well, with the buildup to the war and then moving the Rad Lab up onto the hill, which of course eventually became Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, you could see that basically instead of having to come to Robert Gordon Sproul and asking for money here and there once World War II hit, there was just no question that they could get whatever they wanted basically anytime. And the
Well,
amount of money that
yeah,
was funded.
what happened was that one of the big things that happened was the discovery of plutonium by Glenn Seaborg and his team, Edmund McMillan. And that happened they created it in the cyclotron in December of 1940. And then they actually chemically identified and isolated and figure out what they had there in February of 41, which was before the United States got into the war. The war was ongoing in Europe. And Lawrence took this discovery, and it was much more fissionable, which meant it could lead to nuclear chain reactions and create a bomb than anything they'd ever come across before. So he took that to the federal government and said, we've got this thing. It could be a big thing. And the government was like, okay, well, let's form a committee to decide what to do with this. If this is really something that could be useful if we end up getting into this war. And ironically, I really chuckled when I saw this. The first meeting of this committee, which was to set up all the procedural stuff, was on December 6th of 1941. And those of us who are old enough to have had parents of the World War II generation know December 7th, 1941 is a date that will live in infamy, as President Roosevelt said. That was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So the very day after this initial meeting, all of a sudden it was like everything changed. As I think it was Seaborg who said, well, I thought when I heard the news, okay, we've kind of been jogging toward a goal. Now we're flat out running.
That's right. From that point forward, it was just going to be flat out running, right? Oh, that was a good way to describe it for sure.
The other thing, I just have to tell this story because I
hope you do. Yeah,
I was laughing so hard and horrified at the same time when I read this. It was Seaborg and Edwin McMillan, who both later won Nobel Prizes themselves. They created plutonium in the Rad Lab, in the radiation laboratory building, the little wooden building. I don't exactly know how they did this, but they got it into a lead-lined container. They dressed up in lead suits themselves. They put this container on a long pole that they held between themselves, and they carried it across campus in their little lead suits and up the steps of Gilman Hall to their offices in room 307 Gilman Hall, where it was a laboratory where they did the work to actually isolate it and identify it. Like the idea that these two Nobel Prize winning scientists are carrying the first plutonium sample across campus on a stick. It's like, oh my God.
I know. I hope they got to clear something with environment, health, and safety. I don't think that existed at that time.
Well, they really didn't understand the long-term consequences of radiation at that time. Sure. I mean, they knew you could die from it, radiation poisoning, if you immediately got it, but they didn't realize the long-term damage. I mean, poor old Marie Curie, who discovered radium, she carried like a little sample around with her in a locket or something, and eventually it killed her because she had no idea. Nobody had any idea.
No, it's true.
At least they were doing the lead-lined suits, so that was
Yes, thank goodness for that. But I could just imagine, it would have been funny to have been on campus at that time to have actually seen that happening,
close.
Right? You're right, not too close. Exactly. Oh, stay far away.
Yeah, it seems insane. You can't even imagine something like that.
Well, then, one other thing to point out, which I thought was kind of cool, was once the discovery of plutonium was made, there was this effort, of course, to produce enough of it. And how can you produce enough of it, right? In the quantities that were needed to make a bomb. And so, again, thanks to Ernest O. Lawrence, came up with what's called the Calutron, which I thought was so cool because it's got to pay homage to Cal, right? It was California University Cyclotron, I think
right.
was
well,
really
what happened was they were in the middle of building the big 184-inch cyclotron on the hill that we all know and love now. And it had this, like the most ginormous magnet yet, which is what they needed. This was actually to separate uranium 235 from uranium 238 because they had two competing things going on in the Manhattan Project. They were trying to figure out what's the best way to get this radioactive material. Is it through the uranium or is it through the plutonium? The plutonium was sent off to Chicago, where Enrico Fermi was in charge of it, and Glenn Seaborg went off to Chicago for that period. But on the Hill in Berkeley, they were doing the uranium separations. So they converted what the cyclotron was under construction. And Lawrence says, well, we got this gigantic magnet. We need that to make the separation of the uranium. So let's switch it over and make it a calutron instead.
Right.
Of
right. And then it basically was a hybrid of the standard laboratory mass spectrometer and the cyclotron. It wasn't the most efficient process in the world, but given enough of your materials, you could make enough of it. And I guess that was in Tennessee where they actually produced what was needed, right?
Right. They sent the actual production facility off to Tennessee, Oak Ridge, which is still a thing, I believe, a national laboratory. Sure. World War II just changed everything. It became this intense focus thing. Yeah, obviously there's a lot of issues with the creation of nuclear weapons that we all feel today and will feel for the rest, as long as human beings exist. Any of us who have seen the film Oppenheimer or know our history know what a controversial thing that was and is and always will be. Lawrence didn't seem to have a lot of problems with it. None of the scientists really were objected to it because they were concerned that the Nazis were working on the same project. And they were afraid if the Nazis get it before we do, we're toast, literally. And so that was the reason for this incredible rush. Once the Nazis were defeated and it was Japan, then that becomes a whole different issue. And some people really didn't feel it should have been used. Lawrence had no issues with that at all.
Well,
His
he
view-
did also, kind of advocate for a demonstration
right,
of the bomb rather than for it to have been used
in the
on
first
people.
instance, right,
Yes. So,
which was turned down by the government, and that was that. And he never mentioned that publicly. That was private. My dad was in World War II, and at the time that Hiroshima was bombed, he was being trained to pilot a landing barges for the invasion of Japan that was expected to come. And the Pentagon had projected 1 million American casualties. Now, whether that was accurate, who knows? So he never had any doubts that it was good to get the war over because he thought he might very well have died. Now, we can all have our different views on the morality of these things and whether more could have been done to let the Japanese know that this weapon existed and maybe just surrender now
right.
and all of that. But people at the time made the decisions they made and had to live with them.
Right.
And Oppenheimer had a hard time with it. Lawrence did not. So that's
Right.
pretty much it.
Yeah. No, it's
And then, of course,
true.
after the war, a few years later, the Russians detonated an atomic bomb. And then the next question was, do we move up a next step and go for the hydrogen bomb, which is a much more powerful bomb? And that's where Lawrence and Oppenheimer really split, because Lawrence thought it was the right thing to do, and Oppenheimer was horrified.
Yeah.
And that's how we got the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, not only Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, but also Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And of course, you also have Lawrence Hall of Science named after him. Lots of different places that pay homage to the man who helped to smash atoms.
Yeah, unfortunately for Lawrence, he suffered bouts of a disease called colitis through most of his later years, which is an inflammation of the inner lining of the bowel, which sounds horrible. It was extremely painful. And nobody knows exactly what causes it. There's apparently a variety of causes. One cause is exposure to radiation. So it's possibly, what caused him to have it.
Right. His brother seemed to have lived to a ripe old age. They're doing his nuclear medicine at UCSF. So, you never know if that was a contributing factor. But yeah, as I understand it, he was asked by President Eisenhower at the time to help to negotiate a partial nuclear test ban treaty with the Russians when he had an acute flare up, colitis, and had to be rushed back to the Bay Area and ultimately to Stanford, where they weren't able to save him. They had to remove some of his colon.
Yeah, he had like a
his entire
major
colon.
surgery where they had to basically take out his whole colon. From what I read, if he had survived, his life quality would have been pretty miserable,
Right.
especially for somebody like him, who was so enthusiastic and so vital and physical and loved sports and recreation. And it would have been tough. But still, he died at the age of 59, which is pretty,
Actually, I think even earlier than that, he died at
58.
the age of 57, I think,
57.
right? Because
You're
he had
right.
just
It was
turned 57, right? Only a couple weeks after his birthday in August. A few years later, they discovered yet another element and was named in his honor. In 1961, they discovered lawrencium as another element. So just yet another way that his memory will always be honored. And it's hard to imagine. I mean, when you get your name attributed to an element on the periodic table, it's like, wow.
Well, if you're a Cal person, it's pretty common, let's face it. I mean, I wore my Berkeleyum shirt just, because I didn't have a Lawrencium shirt. One last little tidbit I want to add, because I just found this so interesting, is in these later years in the 50s, while he's running the pure science lab in Berkeley, And he's running the
Yes.
weapons lab in Livermore, and he's raising 6 children, and he's
6.
serving on corporate boards all over the country, and he's serving on all sorts of government and military panels as an expert. He decided what he really needed to do was invent a really good color television tube. I read that, I was like, "What? You don't
In
have
your
enough
spare
to do?"
time. Why not? I mean, and
And
it
he,
was
in fact, did invent a
he
color television tube that was the best at the time. This was like
right.
1952.
And it was
Unfortunately, at that time, there was no color television programming.
right.
People weren't really interested in buying a color television when there wasn't anything to watch. And it's a sort of a chicken and the egg. How do you get to color television? People have to have the sets, you have to have the programming. But apparently it was so good that he had gotten funding from Paramount to help, and they built like a little prototype plant in Oakland, and they were going for it. But eventually they shut it down because they couldn't make a profit. But Paramount sold the idea to Sony, which ultimately used most of the ideas that Lawrence had come up with on his tube in the 60s to create the most popular color television of that time that was in production well into the 90s.
Right, the Sony Trinitron, and I remember growing up having, at least 1 or 2, Sony Trinitrons and, that our family had when I was growing up, and,
Well,
that
thank
thing
Ernest Lawrence.
yeah, and those things, they lasted, like, decades, not like TVs today or anything, that thing lasted. I remember, my parents had it for, like, 30, 40 years or something, and it just, and it was a great color television, so I never knew that it was basically his invention, or at least a large part of what he had come up with just in his spare time,
Right,
to
between running all these labs, and he had more energy than you can even imagine.
Right, right. No, it reminds me a little bit of Walter Gordon. You remember we did that episode way
Right,
back and talking about how in the world is this guy a police officer and an assistant football coach and a
and a
lawyer and
lawyer, and yeah.
and doing all these things, raising a family, all these things at the same time.
They must be well organized is all I can say.
And they must, both in both instances, I'm fairly certain they had amazing wives. The idea of being able to juggle all of that. And in fact, there were 2 things that I noted in after having read a lot of what you had put together in some of the other articles was that, it could very well be in large part thanks to his wife that Ernest Lawrence decided to stay here in Berkeley, because she very much loved being here in the Berkeley area, and they had a home in the Berkeley Hills. And she didn't pass away until 44 years after Ernest Lawrence passed away. So and she remained here in the Bay Area. So anyway, I thought that was pretty
Yeah,
cool.
when he got the offer from Harvard, he did a lot of hemming and hawing, and Oppenheimer said, "Don't do it. You won't have any freedom and independence there." And various other people, "Yeah, but they're going to give you all this money." The deciding factor may very well have been his wife. She was
Right.
from New England, but she was like, "No, I like Berkeley better. Berkeley
Yeah,
is
that's
a
right.
great place to live."
That's right. That's right. All these things that come together that help to make Cal what it is today. I mean, but again, this shining beacon for the rest of the world, where really the academics, the reputation that Cal has everywhere on the planet, I mean, that's all attributable again to Ernest Lawrence being the first guy, and Robert Gordon Sproul for making sure we kept him here. So thank you so much, Leslie. This was a real fun one for me, because again, as a child growing up here in the Bay Area, I just always remembered very vividly going up to the Lawrence Hall of Science and loving my time there and being exposed to science, and no small part why I decided to go into the sciences myself. But yeah, I just couldn't appreciate you more for putting in all the time and effort on this one. That was a lot of good stuff.
Well, thank you, and I enjoyed learning a lot more about Lawrence than I ever knew, and very interesting guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again, Leslie, and go Bears.
Go Bears!
I've missed doing these Cal History episodes with Leslie. As I'm sure you can tell, we always have a lot of fun putting them together. That's going to do it for this Cal History episode. We hope you enjoyed it, and we now turn our attention to welcoming Texas Southern to Memorial Stadium for our home opener on Saturday. If you're anywhere near the Bay Area, please come to the game. We want to see Memorial packed. And I hear that Texas Southern's Ocean of Soul is a band that's not to be missed. And remember to look for our football recap episode when it drops Monday with my co-host, Ahmad Anderson, and David Ortega. How lucky am I to be able to do a podcast talking football with two Cal Hall of Famers? Thank you so much for tuning in. We sincerely appreciate all of you out there listening and watching. This podcast is entirely a labor of love and a reflection of how much we love our university. Please help grow this podcast by telling the whole damn world about us. As I noted at the top of the show, you can tell all your Cal friends to go to tellthewholedamnworld.com. We celebrate all things Cal and the prominent people who are passionate about the University of California. Do you feel Cal is the center of the universe? Do you bleed blue and gold? We want you to tell the whole damn world about it. Go Bears!